Cultures project, which has been going on over the past,
You can get back. Yeah.
is that good? Which has been going on over the past 3 years here at CCM. So I wanted to just give everyone an overview of what this project has been about. And then Dr. Perella is going to present the work that Dr. Maria Lee did transforming her curriculum in a history class. And Professor DeMattio is going to talk about the work that she did transforming the syllabus in an English class. Okay. So I just want to tell you a little bit what this project has been. The project is an AAC&U-funded project. AAC&U worked with an organization called the Democracy Commitment and received NEH, National Endowment of Humanities funding, in order to fund curricular change that focused on democracy, citizenship, and civic action in humanities courses in 10 community colleges within the United States. So this was a competitive grant. A slew of community colleges applied for it, but CCM was awarded one of the Bridging Cultures grants. And we were in a good position to get that grant because really the work that we were doing over the past 3 years built on a much larger grant that CCM had received in the early 2000s. And so for those of you who were there then, you may have remembered the Buildner project, which was a substantial grant of about $280,000, much larger than the Bridging Cultures grant, that really focused on diffusing issues related to diversity into course curricula across the curriculum here at CCM. And many faculty here participated in that, revised their curricula, incorporated issues related to power relations and race, class, ethnicity, gender into courses. So it was a really good campus-wide project. And so this project built upon that to some extent. I wanted to just show you these were the community colleges that received funding. So you can see that they're from across the United States, including Hawaii. We were hoping AAC&U would hold its conferences in Hawaii, but they didn't, so that was too bad. And we defined goals for our project, right, which included infusing teaching and learning about difference, community, and democratic thinking into high enrollment humanities transfer courses. And this was really, a central goal of the Bridging Cultures grant. And I think it's a goal that's incredibly important. So, we very much appreciated what AAC&U and NEH highlighted in this grant. Because I think that focusing on humanities can be very important often when we think about politics, citizenship, political action. I think often in higher education our disciplines become a bit too fragmented. And we think it's okay to relegate the discussion of certain issues to the disciplines that have been developed to look at those, right? But in focusing on the humanities, it pushes us to think about democracy and diversity in ways that challenge us to think about political action much more broadly, to really explore the notion of participatory democracy, to rethink and de-center what is political action and democratic practice. And also in focusing on the humanities, and this is an area that I'm very interested in. I'm a social scientist, of course, a cultural anthropologist, but cultural anthropologists like to think of themselves in a way as betwixt and between the humanities and the social sciences. Our discipline is defined in large part by the method we use, participant observation, in which we immerse ourselves for long periods of time in the communities in which we study. And therefore, we not only look at quantitative data, but we really try to examine the meanings that people construct to make sense out of things that are going on in their lives, the affect and emotions that people experience broader social processes through, and the aesthetics through which people often construct truth and meaning and fulfillment. So this idea of really focusing on the humanities is something that we found very appealing about the Bridging Cultures grant. In addition, we very much appreciated the fact that it was looking at transfer courses in the humanities. Because I think all too often today, when we hear a discourse about community college education within the broader context of the nation state of the United States, we hear about community colleges as being educational institutions that should be focused around preparing young people for work, careers, and making money, all right? And I think all too frequently, we hear a redefinition of what kinds of knowledge are valued and what types of knowledge are funded, taught, and rewarded in colleges and universities. You know, I think that is very much a mistake. I think that it's very important, and we all do this in our courses, to remind ourselves all the time of what the Enlightenment notion of knowledge was, and John Dewey's notion of what education should be, and that this idea that education has a very broad goal, that it is a process that involves the whole person, as a worker, as a citizen, as a member of their family, as a human being. And therefore we have to look at these questions of democracy, of citizenship, of what do we mean by political action across the disciplines in ways that, you know, creatively challenge our students to become more creative, innovative thinkers. So for me, this grant was important because it encourages us to do what it is we all want to do within our classrooms. That's just a book that AAC&U is putting out on civic learning, so it's a resource. So just to briefly sort of sum up the different courses this happened in. So here at CCM, Professor Granero transformed her photography course in order to incorporate a lot of these ideas into the curriculum. Matt Jones redesigned his course, Introduction to Film. Dr. Maria Lee restructured 20th century American history, and Dr. Perella will be talking about that. Professor DeMattio restructured her English course. Professor Hart transformed Elementary Spanish 1, and I did some curricular transformations to the Cultural Geography course here at CCM. And we put together a booklet that has these course transformations in them. I just brought a few copies if anyone's interested. We're going to have these in the CTE as well for people who are interested, and so that includes the course transformations that people have done.
The course that I have tweaked in the fall of 2013 is called American Literature, Colonial to Civil War, which is ENG 249. Now, ENG 249 and ENG 250 are obviously American Literature 1 and American Literature 2. In the first part of it, you have beginnings to 1865, and in the second part of it, you have the Civil War to the 20th century. Now, in the first half, because we're working within a 14-week period, and given certain semesters where you don't always get to Walt Whitman, what I usually do is I do a brief overview of Walt Whitman at the end, and then I usually have those students usually follow into my ENG 250, where I do a more comprehensive review of transcendentalism and Walt Whitman. Now, with that said, EN 249 and EN 250 are very important part of the college's general education humanities courses that are required. Students may take either American literature, world literature, or British literature, and do that in combination. But in American Literature 1, which is 249, I have in fall of 2013 expanded a little bit to look at not only just the colonial period, but by opening up with a background of the Renaissance so that students understand what had driven Europeans to come to the New World. So I look at the explorers. I also look at pagan mythologies. I go directly to Joseph Campbell because I think that he sets really the basis for explaining to students what the word archetype means. And archetype is going to be very important in literature because what you're really looking at is recurring themes, recurring characterizations, and in terms of the Building Bridges initiative, it's the idea of the study of human nature, and within that study of human nature, it's how we learn to build community among ourselves. And in American Lit 1, of course, looking at the Native American tricksters and the oral tradition is very important for them to understand and to listen to. From that movement on, this idea of the 12 steps to the hero's journey is also discussed. Then we look at the explorers, we look at the colonial period, which of course the highlight for the students in the colonial period are the Salem witch trials. So they really want to dig, the crucible, anything that's going to sort of not be boring to them. But I use Arthur Miller's The Crucible as one of my texts. I also use the Scarlet Letter because within the framework of the Building Bridges initiative, the more specifically, the goal of submitting this particular portfolio is to document in accordance with the Building Bridges initiative to pilot and test-teach methods as they apply to diversity, the infusion of democracy and civil engagement as it relates to building community through a common humanity and gender roles in literature. I always begin my courses with a quote by Goethe: "Literature is the humanization of the whole world, and without that humanization, community cannot be built." So what I focus in on, and I did this in both the fall semester of 2013 and in 2014, is looking at the idea of the first part of American literature in a humanist approach, and looking at additional dimensions and concepts like marginality, minority status, diversity, and gender. One of my goals is to develop this idea that there is a possibility that in America everyone can feel like an outsider, and that many American writers, regardless of ethnicity or gender, have struggled with marginalization, alienation, or exclusion. The paradox that is worth exploring and analyzing is that the powerful feeling of being an outsider seems to unite many, if not all, writers into creating a foundation that becomes a large-scale community. The question that is posed, that drives all through the semester, is the idea is that does a collective sense of exclusion provide a tradition that includes us all? Students learn the canons and early traditions of American literature from the beginnings from the colonial period to the Civil War, the influence of women, Native Americans, African Americans, and others who have contributed to the development of American culture through its literature. Because without culture, we would not have literature. Without this building of community, we would not have the ongoing process of the creation of literature. Critical thinking, reading and writing skills are also developed, which are essential to this process of understanding literature and really becoming fully human, in my own opinion. We look at concepts within these groups such as Calvinism, the idea of neoclassicism, or the age of reason, and Romanticism. Another way of looking at it is looking at it as the American Renaissance, American nationalism, where the Declaration of Independence comes in, but I also look at writers that may be marginalized due to ethnicity or gender, and I look at them and compare and contrast them. A good example of this is Emerson and Thoreau. Now, Emerson and Thoreau, in their study of transcendentalism, of course, became gods in that genre. But if you look at someone like Frederick Douglass, who also held those same values of transcendence, certainly did not have the socioeconomic power or capacity to thrive as well. And what's interesting about Douglass is that though in his narrative he talks about the brutality of slavery, what I think is most important is he talks about it in how it affects the human being in terms of self-affirmation and self-knowledge. And I think that that's very important for students to see, that this is the kind of thinking that if we are going to really truly build our bridges, as it were, we need to really understand that in some way we are all marginalized. We all have something that keeps us on the outside that will eventually emerge, I believe. And Frederick Douglass is an excellent example of this, as is Harriet Jacobs, Phyllis Wheatley. So I try to look at some of those writers in comparison to the more standard canons. Let's see. What I have done is prepare teaching assignments, which include presentations in class. I tend to be traditional in terms of midterms and final examinations, which include both separate objective sections and, most importantly, essay responses. Every week, students receive thought questions and study questions. They are broken into groups, and they are made responsible for particular questions that earn them particular points toward their grades. I can tell you a little bit about that. Let's see. Obviously, there is an strict attendance policy in place, reading and participation, and what I mean in terms of participation is active thinking about what it means to build community, what it means to engage in a discussion of civil engagement and democracy in a diverse and empowering setting. Some of the other texts that I use, one is when we're looking at the colonial period, which is probably of interest to all of you history people out there. Salem Possessed and the Social Origins of Witchcraft by Paul Boyer and Stephen Niesenbaum. We also use the Norton Anthology, obviously. I take sections from Joseph Campbell's The Hero with 1,000 Faces and The Power of Myth with Bill Moyers, which there are film clips that I use in that section as well. There are weekly quizzes, there are in-class student groups, in-class objective tests, in and out-of-class essays that oftentimes are generated from thought questions that are given weekly. And I find that when they each have to be responsible for a particular question, I find that you don't have small groups that sort of go haywire. They have to be responsible for something in order to earn the points. So that's what I have been doing with them. Let's see, we talked about teaching materials. Let's see. Oh, student learning outcomes. In 2013, originally I had started with what I thought I could infuse research into the course. I thought I might try to do a research paper in that course. And I found that what worked much, much better were shorter critical responses when they had outside materials, which I would either bring in or I would bring them to the library and put them in the right direction of what we were looking for. For example, if we were talking about the Salem witch trials, we would go over to the library, that we would get sources, and I found that it was much more manageable for them to look at maybe one or two sources and then respond in a critical way than it was for them to do what they had previously done in Composition 2 with a research paper. I really found that terse is better in this case, that though my course it's broad and it sort of embodies all of the characteristics, which made it easy, sort of, to infuse the Building Bridges initiative. My reflections for fall 2014, I would have to say that I would like to continue this discourse in my classes. I would like to look at more Latino sources. I would like to look at other ethnic sources to infuse into the course. But because the course is specifically titled American Literature, what I try to do is bring in this idea of infusing and not looking at marginalism as a negative thing, but looking at it as a positive thing. Because when you look to American Lit 2 or in 250, and you look at a writer like Ralph Ellison, you know, certainly the Invisible Man hibernated, but he didn't stay hibernated for long. He finally had to emerge. So my feeling about it is that in 2015, I hope to continue my scholarship in this area. I have to say thank you very much to my mentor, my friend, my colleague, Dr. Shenham, Dr. Perella, all of the people that were on the Building Bridges team with me, that helped me, guided me, inspired me, and I look forward to continuing in 2015 into 2016 and to continue this kind of work. It's been very enriching. Thank you so much for your time.
So do we have any questions or discussion? Yes.
I'm intrigued by this idea of the collective sense of alienation and marginalization and being an outsider as being a unifier. I think that's really interesting. You mentioned you used the Norton textbook. Are there any textbooks that you feel do this best? Because you know that the canon has been undergoing changes through the years, and some are more inclusive than others. So I'm just wondering which textbooks you find, or I mean, your Norton, I guess.
I have used the Norton Shorter edition for two reasons. First of all, they have a wonderful section of early Native American narratives, which when you're talking about building community, in these cases you're looking at polytheism, and they learn to build a community through that. And when you move forward, the Norton anthology, I think, is very, very helpful, very, very helpful in that way. I used to use the other anthology, but it was too limited, I thought.
I think some are more conservative and have made less changes,
Yes.
whereas I think the Norton has made more changes.
Yes, I mean, and when you're looking at things like, especially when you get to American Lit 2 and you're looking at regionalism and you're looking at all those things, it all goes back to those kind of pagan mythologies and the idea of setting those archetypes up. So I think it follows itself right. It's sort of a continuing stream. You know, I'm always amazed when students, they want to take one before the other. They want to take the Civil War to the 20th century first, rather than going straight through it. But as long as they do it, I'm fine with that. But the Building Bridges has been an enriching experience, and certainly in scholarship and classroom experience, and I hope my students have benefited. Yes, Dr. Deb.
I was intrigued by your comment that some students want to take, the courses in a historical progression.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember, my memory is pretty long, and I've tried to purge it of things like this, like thinking back. I remember that the first course in American Lit, English 249, was once a prerequisite for English 250.
Yes, right.
But under the leadership
That's right.
of Vice President Cliff L. Wood, that prerequisite was dissolved.
It flipped, yes. Yeah, I mean, for me personally, I am a student of CCM. I was here at CCM, and it was always a prerequisite. I know that was even back when the dinosaurs walked the earth, but I find when you're taking it in succession like that, you really do understand the path that you're on versus the reverse. But that's my own opinion, and they have their own decision to make about that. But certainly the American Lit courses, like American History, I think are perfect courses for this kind of work.
We had the same change in history.
So,
That you do,
yeah.
US 1 is not a prerequisite for US 2 any longer.
But we had a long discussion about that in sociology,
And
because we
yeah.
used to have
Mhm.
Soc 120 leading into contemporary social issues. And then when the state revised the general ed requirements, they slashed some social science requirements. And as a result, students don't have a 2-course requirement. And I do think it's a major, major issue in any of these disciplines, because I think what happens then is that the community college students are taking these fragmented courses. They never have the opportunity to build on what they get in the introductory one in the next course in the sequence. And I think it's a problem for our students.
Hey Deb, I just was curious for American Lit 2, how deep into the 20th century do you get? Like Vietnam and Tim O'Brien that far? Or because maybe there's a way to get more diverse voices with like the increasing diversity in America in the latter part of the 20th century?
I agree with you. I agree with you there. I think that what can be challenging in the second half of American literature is you can't go without Huck Finn. It's really, I feel like I'm like quoting Hemingway or something now. It's like the basis of all American literature. So sometimes you have to remember with our students, Huck Finn is no easy read. But whereas when you get further into the 20th century and they can sort of begin to identify, so I agree with you. I mean, there was a point at one point several years ago when I was teaching over the summer, I tried to teach Jack Kerouac's On the Road, and I thought that would be something that they would embrace, and they struggled through it, struggled. So I agree with you. I think if we can get further into the 20th century, maybe with shorter works, short stories, poems, things like that, or plays, I think that would work. But if you were going to get into a larger novel, and what can be problematic too, or challenging, is in anthologies when they chop up novels. That's a real challenge, I think, for all of us. The 2 chapters of, Invisible Man, it's always Battle Royale and the second chapter. So that can be problematic, but, there are ways around it. There are ways of getting it in. But I think as far as piquing student interest, yes, someone like Tim O'Brien getting to that point would be terrific. But again, it's a lot. There's a lot to cover in 14 weeks in that area, as it would be for history, I would assume too. I hope that answered your question.
Absolutely.
Okay. Are we good? All right. Thank you very much. Thank you.